Just picture it. Hundreds of millions of tons of concrete, steel, and water working together every single second to hold back one of the most powerful rivers on Earth. The Yangtze River has carved its way through the heart of China for millions of years, and it's been both a source of life and destruction. But since the early 2000s, it's been controlled by the massive wall of the Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric power plant ever built. It stretches for over 2,300 meters across and stands 185 meters tall, almost the height of a 60-story skyscraper. Behind it, a reservoir stretching over 600 kilometers long and holding back more than 39 billion cubic meters of water. That's over 5 trillion gallons. Now this thing is not just big, it's a modern marvel. The Three Gorges Dam wasn't just built for show, it was built with two major goals in mind: stop the Yangtze's constant flooding and produce a huge amount of clean energy, and in many ways it's done both. When the last main turbine came online in the year 2012, the dam reached its full capacity in Ethiopia, 22,500 megawatts, which is enough to power tens of millions of homes. In the year 2020, after an especially intense monsoon season, it hit a world record, generating over 111 terawatt hours of electricity in just 1 year. That broke the record set by Brazil's Itaipu Dam. But here's the thing about it. While it was built to protect and power, the dam now stands as a massive potential threat. The bigger something is, the harder it hits when it falls. If the Three Gorges Dam were to collapse, even partially, the effects wouldn't just be felt in the areas right below it. The disaster would reach across an entire region and ripple out through the entire world. Hundreds of millions of people live and work in cities scattered all along the Yangtze River. These include places like Yichang, right below the dam, and larger cities like Wuhan and Nanjing, farther downriver. These places are not just home to millions. They're packed with infrastructure, agriculture, factories, and key shipping routes. So now comes the big question: how could something so massive and so carefully engineered actually fail? What would it take? Let's start with the most basic problem: gravity and water pressure. That massive wall of water behind the dam, it's always pushing forward. The structure is built to handle that, but just barely. Like every major dam in the Three Gorges is constantly under stress. Over time, even small movements in the concrete or shifts in the foundation can start to cause problems. And the Yangtze River itself adds to the danger. It's one of the muddiest rivers in the world, and that matters. Every year, around 40 million tons of sediment move downstream. But with the dam in the way, a lot of that silt ends up piling up behind it. Over time, that buildup puts even more pressure on the base of the dam, making the water harder to manage and the structure more vulnerable. Now here's where things get more complicated. The dam sits on a fault line, not a super active one like in California or Japan, but active enough that earthquakes do happen. And scientists have been warning for years about something called reservoir-induced seismicity. Basically, all that water pressing down on the earth can trigger quakes on its own. There's another problem too: landslides. When the water level in the reservoir rises, it loosens the soil around the edges. Since the reservoir was filled, there have now been dozens of major landslides, some so powerful they've caused waves inside the reservoir itself. In one case, tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth and rock came crashing into the water in seconds. Imagine what that could do if the landslide happened right near the dam wall. Even though Chinese officials monitor the dam closely and carry out maintenance and inspections, some experts have pointed out that the original construction may not have been perfect. One hydrologist, Wang Weilo, raised red flags about how the design, construction, and inspection were all handled by the same group. He warned that cracks, rushed schedules, and poor quality materials could come back to haunt the structure down the road. So now we're left with this picture: an aging mega dam holding back one of the largest reservoirs on Earth, sitting in a place prone to earthquakes, dealing with increasing sediment buildup, surrounded by unstable slopes, and facing stronger and more unpredictable storms every year. It hasn't failed yet. But if something went wrong, even one thing, it could be the beginning of a chain reaction, and once that chain starts, there may be no way to stop it. Next, we're going to break down exactly how that failure might unfold. For Dinaos, the conditions that would line up, the timeline of collapse, and what cities would be hit first. It's not just about whether it could happen, no what. It's about how fast, how far, and how horrifying it really could be. It's easy to look at the Three Gorges Dam and just see strength. After all, we're talking about a wall of concrete that's over 2,300 meters long and about 185 meters high. But behind all that concrete is a system that's constantly under stress: physical, environmental, and human. It's a complicated machine built into one of the most unpredictable rivers on Earth. And the truth is, there's a long list of ways things could start to unravel. Let's start with one of the biggest concerns: seismic activity. The dam is built in a region of China that sits on several fault lines. Normally we think of earthquakes as something that just happens out of nowhere, but in this case, the weight of the reservoir itself, billions of tons of water pressing down on the Earth, can trigger what's called reservoir-induced seismicity. That means earthquakes that wouldn't normally happen might occur just because of the stress the water puts on the crust beneath it. Some scientists believe that dozens of small tremors recorded in the region since the reservoir was filled are likely linked to this exact phenomenon. A small quake might be manageable, but a big one, even just in the wrong spot, could push the structure past its limits. There's also the issue of landslides. Ever since the water level rose behind the dam, the steep terrain along the reservoir has been eroding. That's not just theory, there have been real events already. In May of 2009, huge chunks of land slid into the water at Wuxia Gorge, sending shock waves across the surface. In the first few months of 2010 alone, nearly 100 major landslides were reported in the reservoir zone. That might not sound like a direct threat to the dam, but the sediment and debris from those landslides flow toward the dam, slowly clogging the reservoir. That raises water levels, increases pressure on the structure, and decreases the amount of water it can safely hold during floods. Over time, this puts the entire system into a tighter and tighter corner. Now let's talk sediment. The Yangtze River has always carried a massive load of silt and mud. Before the dam was built, much of that sediment flowed downstream naturally, keeping the river's ecosystem in balance and reinforcing the riverbanks all the way to the coast. But now, most of that sediment settles in the reservoir. In fact, estimates suggest that about 40 million tons of sediment pour into the dam each year. With slower water flow above the dam, there's nowhere for it to go. It just builds up. That buildup doesn't just reduce capacity, it shifts water pressure onto different parts of the dam and alters how water flows through its turbines and spillways. The result is a system that's constantly adjusting to an ever-changing internal load, and that kind of pressure over time wears things down. Then you've got aging materials. The main dam was structurally completed in 2006, but that doesn't mean it was left alone. In fact, the full power station only became fully operational in 2012. And the final part of the project, a massive ship lift, wasn't finished until 2015. That means different parts of the structure were completed at different times, and they've been weathering the elements for over a decade now. Concrete expands and contracts with heat and cold. Steel corrodes, seals degrade. It all adds up over time. Engineers inspect and maintain the dam constantly, but some experts have raised concerns that early construction might not have met the highest standards. Hydrologist Wang Weilo, one of the loudest voices of criticism, has even claimed there were signs of cracking during construction and possible issues with concrete quality. These claims haven't been confirmed by the government, but they add to the worry that not everything behind the scenes is rock solid. One of the more delicate balancing acts the dam has to manage is between energy generation and flood control. When the reservoir is full, the dam can generate its maximum output of electricity. But in flood season, the water level has to be lowered ahead of time to create space for incoming rain. That trade-off creates a constant back and forth between power production and safety. If heavy rains come sooner or harder than expected, the operators might not have enough time to lower the reservoir, and that could raise the risk of overtopping, where water spills uncontrollably over the top of the dam. Even though the dam is equipped with emergency spillways, a sudden surge, say from a failed upstream dam or a monster storm, could overwhelm the system. And extreme weather isn't just a possibility anymore. Climate change is pushing rainfall patterns into new territory. The summer of 2020 saw record-breaking floods in China, pushing the Three Gorges Dam to its limits. The water level rose to over 165 meters, very close to its designed maximum of 175 meters. In response, authorities opened floodgates, unleashing flows of more than 70,000 cubic meters per second to try and lower the pressure. But with each flood season, the margin for error seems to shrink. And this year, June of 2025, weather forecasts are predicting another season of intense rainfall. Engineers are already working to lower the reservoir, but no one knows if that will be enough. So, when you put it all together, earthquakes, landslides, sedimentation, aging infrastructure, and increasingly extreme weather, you can start to see how a chain reaction might begin. The dam doesn't have to fail in one big moment. It could be a slow buildup of smaller issues, stacking up until something finally gives, and if it does, the next part of the story begins. What happens when a wall of water starts racing toward some of the most populated cities on Earth? That's what we'll explore next. If the Three Gorges Dam were to collapse, the destruction would be unlike anything China or the world has ever seen. This isn't just a local disaster. This would be a chain reaction of flooding, infrastructure failure, and mass displacement on an unimaginable scale. To understand how devastating it could be, we have to follow the water step by step, city by city, hour by hour. The first to be hit would be Yicheng, the city closest to the dam. Yicheng sits less than 40 kilometers downstream. Within minutes, a wall of water tens of meters high could crash into its streets, wiping out homes, power lines, and transportation routes. Most residents would have little or no time to escape. Bridges would collapse. Roads would vanish under waves of debris-filled water. The force of that initial surge could be enough to destroy every structure in its path. But the water wouldn't stop at Yicheng. It would keep moving downstream, building momentum as it rushed through the Yangtze River basin. Within hours, the flood could reach Jingzhou, a historic city with a population of over 5 million people. Much of Jingzhou lies on flat land near the river. That geography means slower drainage and deeper flooding. Even if early warnings were issued, evacuation would be chaotic, transportation would be overwhelmed, and low-lying neighborhoods could be completely submerged. Next, the water would bear down on Wuhan. This is not just a large city, it's a megacity. Over 11 million people live in Wuhan, and it's a key hub for finance, transportation, and technology. 3 major rivers, including the Yangtze and Han, converge there. If floodwaters from upstream hit Wuhan at the same time as heavy local rainfall, the result would be catastrophic. Subways would flood, the airport would be rendered useless, power stations, water treatment facilities, and hospitals could all be knocked offline. Rescue efforts would be nearly impossible in the early hours, and tens of thousands of lives could be at risk. The damage would continue far beyond Wuhan. Cities like Zhejiang, Nanjing, and even Shanghai, over 1,000 kilometers away, could feel the effects. While the force of the water would weaken over that distance, the volume would remain staggering. In lower areas, floodwaters could spread across vast swaths of farmland, drowning crops and displacing rural communities. Ports and industrial zones along the Yangtze River would be paralyzed. Highways and railway lines would be washed out. The cost to China's economy alone could stretch into the trillions of dollars. One of the most devastating long-term effects would be the collapse of the interconnected dam and levee systems along the Yangtze River. The Three Gorges Dam is part of a larger network of over 100,000 dams across the country, many of which are smaller and older. If the Three Gorges Dam failed, the flood would likely breach several of these structures as it surged downstream. Each failed dam would release more water, compounding the disaster and spreading it wider. Entire provinces could see their water systems permanently altered. And then there's the human cost. Conservative estimates suggest that over 400 million people live within the greater Yangtze River basin. Even if only a fraction of those people were directly affected, we're still talking about tens of millions displaced. Millions more could face shortages of clean water, food, and shelter. Disease outbreaks, especially in overcrowded evacuation centers, would be a serious risk. With supply chains cut and medical infrastructure damaged, emergency response teams would struggle to keep up. It would take weeks, possibly months, for aid to reach all the areas in need. Environmental damage would be another hidden but massive problem. The reservoir behind the Three Gorges Dam contains not only water, but also industrial runoff, sewage, and heavy metals that have settled there over years. If the dam failed, all of that would be swept downstream. Toxic materials could contaminate farmland, rivers, and coastal waters. The Yangtze River Delta, one of China's most fertile and economically vital regions, could be poisoned for years to come. In global terms, the collapse of the Three Gorges Dam would also disrupt international trade. Ports like Shanghai and Ningbo handle a significant percentage of China's exports. If those ports were flooded or cut off from rail and road transport, it would affect supply chains around the world. Factories would shut down. Prices for electronics, clothing, machinery, and other goods would spike globally. The economic ripple effect would be felt in Europe, North America, Southeast Asia, and beyond. But beyond all the statistics and projections, The heart of the tragedy would be the human stories. Families separated, entire neighborhoods erased, generations of history drowned in minutes. In many ways, the Three Gorges Dam was built to protect people from exactly this kind of nightmare. But if it were to fail, it wouldn't just be a collapse of concrete, it would be a collapse of trust, of planning, and of an entire way of life for millions. In the next part, we'll explore how prepared China is for such a worst-case scenario, and whether the systems in place today would be enough to stop the unthinkable from becoming reality. When it comes to the potential collapse of the Three Gorges Dam, the Chinese government has not been silent. There are emergency plans in place, but whether they are enough is another question entirely. A structure as massive and consequential as this demands a coordinated and layered defense system. Yet even with decades of planning, some cracks cannot be patched with paperwork alone. First, it's important to understand what kind of monitoring and early warning systems are already active. The Three Gorges Dam is equipped with thousands of sensors that measure pressure, stress, water levels, and seismic activity. These sensors transmit real-time data to control centers in Yichang and Beijing. Engineers claim that the dam can withstand earthquakes up to magnitude 7 and has overflow spillways designed to reduce pressure during extreme flooding. But no amount of data can offer total certainty. If the dam fails suddenly due to sabotage, a landslide, or a rare upstream earthquake, these systems would only provide seconds or minutes of warning to those in the path of destruction. Beyond the dam itself, China has developed a tiered emergency response structure. This includes local, provincial, and national crisis management teams. In theory, evacuation plans are regularly reviewed and practiced in some downstream cities. Large urban centers like Wuhan and Nanjing have contingency plans that include siren alerts, emergency broadcasts, and designated evacuation routes. Drones, satellite imaging, and even artificial intelligence tools are being used to track weather patterns and detect potential structural anomalies, but planning does not always translate into execution. One of the main challenges is geography. The areas most at risk lie along the Yangtze River, one of the most densely populated river basins on Earth. Some villages and towns are isolated or surrounded by mountains, with only narrow roads in and out. In such places, evacuation efforts could be delayed by traffic, poor communication, or landslides triggered by heavy rain. In larger cities, roads are often congested even during normal times. A mass evacuation of millions within a few hours is nearly impossible. There is also the question of political control. The Chinese government tightly manages public information. In the past, warnings about structural issues with dams or floods have been delayed, downplayed, or withheld altogether to avoid public panic. During the 2021 floods in Zhengzhou, for example, official reports did not fully capture the severity of the disaster until after the worst damage had occurred. If a similar pattern of secrecy happened during a Three Gorges emergency, valuable time could be lost, time that could save lives. In addition, while the Three Gorges Dam is the largest hydroelectric project in the world, China has over 98,000 other dams, many of them smaller, older, and more vulnerable. These dams form a cascading system of water control. If the Three Gorges Dam were to fail, that would place immense pressure on this entire system. The failure of even a handful of secondary dams downstream could make the disaster significantly worse, and unlike the main structure, many of these smaller dams are not as well monitored or maintained. On top of all this, military assets would likely be mobilized in the event of a collapse. The People's Liberation Army has rapid response units trained for flood rescue and logistics. Boats, helicopters, and temporary shelters could be deployed to major cities and evacuation zones, but again, scale is the issue. It is one thing to rescue thousands, it is another to respond to tens of millions needing aid all at once. If supply chains are broken, bridges washed away, and power grids offline, even the best equipped teams will struggle. China has made some efforts to improve community-level preparedness. In schools and factories, some citizens undergo annual emergency drills. Government apps can push evacuation alerts directly to smartphones. Civil defense shelters have been converted in some regions to handle flood refugees, yet access to these resources is uneven. Many rural areas still lack digital infrastructure or reliable emergency communication. International cooperation is also limited. Due to political tensions and national security concerns, the Chinese government does not openly share structural data on the Three Gorges Dam with other nations. This makes outside assessment difficult and hinders offers of international assistance. If the dam were to fail, countries downstream, especially those reliant on Chinese supply chains, would receive little advance notice or coordination. One key blind spot in China's emergency planning is environmental fallout. While the focus has largely been on water and human evacuation, there is less clarity on how the government would contain chemical spills or manage water-borne diseases in flooded areas. Large-scale flooding often causes sewage overflow, industrial leakage, and hazardous contamination. In the chaos of mass displacement, it is unlikely that environmental mitigation would be prioritized. In short, China has systems in place to monitor, respond to, and possibly manage a dam-related emergency, but none of them have ever been tested at the scale of a complete Three Gorges failure. Even with the most advanced technology, fastest troops, and strictest planning, the sheer size of the population and the speed at which such a disaster would unfold leave a terrifying question. Would any of it be enough? In the final part, we will examine the long-term consequences of a collapse, not just for China, but for the world. From food security and energy disruption to political fallout and global markets, the failure of this dam would echo far beyond the riverbanks. If the Three Gorges Dam collapsed, the devastation would not stop at China's borders. What begins as a physical disaster could rapidly spiral into an economic, environmental, and geopolitical crisis on a global scale. In this final part, we look beyond the immediate flood zones to explore how the world might feel the shockwaves of a failure that would alter global systems overnight. To begin, China plays a central role in the global economy. It is the world's largest manufacturing hub and the largest exporter of goods. The Yangtze River Basin is home to more than 400 million people and contributes more than 40% of the country's GDP. Major industrial cities like Wuhan, Chongqing, and Nanjing rely heavily on the transportation, water, and power infrastructure connected to the dam. If that infrastructure is destroyed, it would trigger an immediate collapse in manufacturing output, especially in electronics, automotive parts, and heavy machinery. The supply chain disruption would be massive. Ports and railways in the region would be paralyzed. Global companies that depend on Chinese factories, ranging from consumer tech brands to pharmaceutical giants, would experience immediate shortages. Products could disappear from shelves around the world within weeks. Shipping delays would skyrocket. Prices on raw materials and finished goods would spike, contributing to inflation in already fragile global markets. The energy impact would also be severe. The Three Gorges Dam is the single largest hydroelectric power station in the world. If it fails, its massive contribution to China's grid, around 2% of national energy, would vanish. While this percentage may sound small, it supports critical infrastructure in eastern and central China, including power for hospitals, water treatment plants, and communication systems. Rolling blackouts could follow across several provinces, straining emergency response and industrial recovery. Environmental consequences would not be limited to floodwaters. The Yangtze is a vital artery for agriculture and ecology. Its basin supports rice, wheat, and fish production for hundreds of millions. A sudden collapse would destroy crops, spread industrial toxins from submerged factories, and kill off entire aquatic ecosystems. This could lead to long-term food shortages within China and affect global food trade, particularly in Asia and Africa, where Chinese agricultural exports are critical. International financial markets would react instantly. Investors often respond to disasters with panic, and a collapse of this scale would send shockwaves through stock exchanges in Hong Kong, Tokyo, London, and New York. China's currency could fall, foreign investment could stall, and insurance firms with exposure to Chinese assets would face massive payouts. The economic ripple effect would likely trigger recessions in multiple countries, especially those closely tied to China through trade or debt. Then there's the political dimension. A collapse of the Three Gorges Dam would be seen not just as a natural disaster, but as a national failure. It is one of China's proudest infrastructure achievements, a symbol of power, progress, and engineering superiority. If it failed, the Chinese Communist Party could face intense public backlash. Protests could break out, especially if the government was seen as hiding information or mishandling the response. In the worst-case scenario, such a collapse could threaten internal political stability. Internationally, tensions could rise. Neighboring countries downriver, such as Vietnam, might demand answers or compensation if they are affected by flooding, or water shortages, some nations may accuse China of negligence or failing to maintain a project with global consequences. At the same time, geopolitical rivals might exploit the chaos to gain influence or negotiate more favorable trade terms. Cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, and border tensions could all increase as a result. Humanitarian aid would become another flashpoint. If China requested or accepted international assistance, questions would arise about coordination, transparency, and access. Foreign governments and NGOs may be hesitant or restricted in what they are allowed to do. The sheer number of displaced people, possibly tens of millions, would overwhelm aid systems, and China might be forced to prioritize urban recovery over rural survival. This would raise serious ethical concerns and could strain relations with other countries already dealing with global refugee crises. In the long term, the collapse would permanently reshape how nations view megaprojects and large-scale dams. For decades, the Three Gorges Dam has been cited as an example of engineering ambition. Its failure could chill future hydroelectric investment, trigger stricter international engineering codes, and increase skepticism of top-down infrastructure development. At the same time, countries may double down on decentralizing power grids and water management systems to avoid similar catastrophes. Ultimately, the failure of the Three Gorges Dam would be more than a Chinese disaster. It would be a global turning point. From the floodplains of central China to the trading floors of distant financial capitals, every corner of the world would feel its impact. Whether through broken supply chains, rising prices, shifting alliances, or the haunting image of a drowned megastructure, the collapse would mark the end of one era and the start of something far less stable. America is a nation defined by its control over water, with nearly 92,000 dams scattered across its landscape. These structures hold back rivers and reservoirs that supply cities, irrigate farms, and generate electricity. Yet the average age of these dams is over 60 years, and thousands are classified as high hazard, meaning that if they fail, the consequences would be catastrophic. Imagine for a moment that in a single instant, every one of these dams collapsed simultaneously. In the west, the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, a 6.6 million ton concrete wedge holding back Lake Mead, but disintegrates. A colossal wall of water surges through Black Canyon, obliterating Laughlin and Bullhead City within minutes. Downstream, Davis and Parker dams are instantly overwhelmed, the waves carving a new path through the desert toward Yuma, Arizona. Across Arizona and Nevada, cities reliant on this water supply are cut off and millions are trapped in the chaos. In California, the Oroville Dam, the tallest in the United States at 770 feet, fails. Lake Oroville pours down the Feather River Valley as a 30-foot high, highway speed wall of water. Oroville, Yuba City, and Marysville are submerged in minutes. The Sacramento River Delta is devastated. The Central Valley, a crucial agricultural hub, transformed into a turbulent inland sea. Crops are destroyed, irrigation systems obliterated, and homes and infrastructure swept away. The Pacific Northwest faces a similar nightmare. Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River disappears, releasing the contents of Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake. The resulting flood sweeps toward Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, obliterating riverside communities and tearing through bridges, roads, and power lines. Across the Midwest, the Missouri River's massive dams, including Fort Peck in Montana, fail in succession. The river becomes an unstoppable battering ram, inundating Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. Kansas City and St. Louis are hit with waves capable of erasing entire neighborhoods. The Mississippi River, already swollen, cannot contain the surge, compounding the destruction. In the east, thousands of older dams in densely populated areas collapse. The Tennessee Valley Authority's network of 29 hydroelectric dams becomes a chain of destruction. In Pennsylvania, New York, and New England, smaller mill dams unleash torrents that wipe out towns and reshape valleys. Within the first hour, millions of lives are lost. Entire cities are underwater, and the continent is violently transformed. The sheer scale of devastation is unlike anything in human history, and for the survivors, the nightmare has only just begun. As the floodwaters carve new paths across the continent, a second catastrophe begins, this one not made of water, but of the systems that depend on it. The United States power grid, already strained by the sudden loss of hydroelectric dams, begins to fail on a massive scale. Hydroelectric capacity vanishes instantly, eliminating roughly 6 to 7% of the nation's electricity generation. Automated safety systems struggle to compensate, but the imbalance is too great. Within hours, entire regions are plunged into darkness, and without power, basic services grind to a halt. The loss of rivers and reservoirs creates an immediate crisis for nuclear power plants. Over 90 reactors across the country rely on continuous water flow for cooling. Emergency diesel generators engage, but without sufficient water, the pumps only circulate air and debris. Temperatures inside reactor cores begin to rise, creating the potential for meltdowns. Plants like Browns Ferry in Alabama, Cooper in Nebraska, and Palo Verde in Arizona face an unprecedented risk. In some areas, radioactive contamination begins to spread, compounding the human and environmental toll. Transportation infrastructure collapses under the weight of the catastrophe. Bridges and highways are destroyed or submerged, leaving railways twisted and unusable. Ports and shipping channels are blocked by debris from broken dams and eroded riverbanks. Food, fuel, and medical supplies cannot move, isolating communities across the country. Urban centers, already flooded or cut off, descend into chaos. Communication networks falter as well. Without power, cellular towers, data centers, and internet infrastructure fail. Emergency broadcast systems are overwhelmed, leaving citizens in the dark, not only about their surroundings, but also about official instructions or evacuation routes. Social media becomes a patchwork of fragmented reports, rumors, and pleas for help, but connectivity is inconsistent at best. Government and emergency response efforts are paralyzed. FEMA and the National Guard struggle to coordinate relief when every state is simultaneously affected. There are no safe zones to stage operations from, no intact supply lines, and no secure transportation corridors. Decisions that normally take hours must now be made in minutes, with lives hanging in the balance. By the end of the first 24 hours, America has transformed into a continent of isolated survivors. Water is gone, power is out, and communication is fractured. The immediate struggle for survival is over for some, but the long, grim fight for existence is only beginning. Millions are displaced, and the infrastructure that once held the nation together has been erased, leaving a landscape of devastation and uncertainty. Weeks turn into months, and the initial wall of water has long since moved inland, leaving a country unrecognizable. Entire river valleys have been carved anew, sediment and debris reshaping landscapes. Cities that were once vibrant hubs lie in ruins, submerged streets now replaced by mud, wreckage, and stagnant pools. Survivors face a harsh new reality. The infrastructure that supported life, power, sanitation, transport, and communication is gone, and with it the normal rhythms of society. Thirst becomes a daily struggle. The floodwaters themselves are undrinkable, contaminated with industrial chemicals, sewage, and heavy metals released from destroyed dams and water treatment facilities. Communities scavenge whatever remains. Rainwater collected from rooftops, abandoned swimming pools, or any small reservoirs that survived. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases spread rapidly, turning makeshift camps into centers of illness. Mortality rates soar, particularly among children, the elderly, and the immunocompromised. Food shortages compound the crisis. With farmland flooded, machinery destroyed, and irrigation systems obliterated, crops cannot be planted or harvested. The Midwest's grain belt, California's Central Valley, and the Mississippi Delta, all once breadbaskets, are largely unusable. Supply chains are paralyzed, making imported or stored food difficult to access. Starvation becomes a central threat, forcing mass migration as survivors follow rivers and coastlines in search of whatever edible resources remain. The social fabric phrase. Law enforcement is stretched thin, and local authorities are often powerless. Armed groups and militias emerge, controlling small caches of resources, particularly clean water. Communities become fortified enclaves where access to essentials is dictated by strength rather than law. Tribalism and barter replace governance, and conflict over territory and supplies escalates. Survival rather than cooperation becomes the primary rule of life. Environmental destruction continues. Deforested slopes destabilized by flood erosion trigger landslides, blocking rivers and burying towns. Toxic sediment settles in former lakes and reservoirs, poisoning soils and altering ecosystems. Fish and wildlife populations collapse, further disrupting the delicate balance that once supported human sustenance. The landscape itself is in constant flux, unpredictable and hostile. By the end of the first year, the United States is fundamentally altered. The scale of human displacement, disease, starvation, and environmental collapse has created a continent where the majority of people live in constant struggle. Cities are ghostly remnants, transportation is unreliable or impossible, and a new harsh form of social order based on survival and resource control has taken hold. The once interconnected nation now exists as isolated pockets of humanity, clinging to life in a radically transformed and unforgiving landscape. 2 decades after the simultaneous collapse of every dam in America, the nation is unrecognizable. Entire river systems have been permanently rerouted, valleys carved deeper, and floodplains transformed into chaotic wetlands or barren plains. The once productive agricultural heartlands remain largely unusable, forcing communities to adapt with small-scale subsistence farming along the edges of surviving arable land. Forests have reclaimed many abandoned urban and rural areas, but the regrowth is patchy, often interspersed with toxic sediment deposits left from the floods. Survivors live in decentralized, self-sufficient communities. Large cities are relics, their skyscrapers slowly collapsing into the mud, and only the coastal areas with operational desalination plants have maintained any semblance of organized governance. These fortified city-states ration water with precision, enforce strict population controls, and employ heavily armed patrols to prevent raids. Even with these measures, life is precarious. Every day is a battle against the elements and resource scarcity. Technology has regressed. Steam power, wood-fired engines, and windmills replace electricity in many settlements. Communications are mostly analog, relying on radio transmissions and courier networks. Knowledge is treasured, particularly agricultural manuals, engineering guides, and medical texts, as communities attempt to rebuild sustainable systems without modern infrastructure. Education is localized, and literacy becomes a crucial survival skill, passed down selectively within families or trusted groups. The environmental consequences are ongoing. Radioactive contamination from the nuclear plants that failed in the immediate aftermath has created exclusion zones in parts of the Southeast and Midwest. Wildlife has adapted in strange ways, with some species thriving in flooded regions, while others have disappeared entirely. Rivers, though altered, support pockets of fish and other aquatic life, but the ecosystems are fragile and highly sensitive to human activity. Cultural memory has shifted. Stories of the old America, with flowing rivers, green pastures, and plentiful water, are passed down as myths. Water is no longer taken for granted. It defines status, power, and survival. Art, music, and storytelling revolve around the scarcity and preciousness of water, commemorating the catastrophe that reshaped the continent. Despite the devastation, human resilience endures. Communities trade, form alliances, and slowly rebuild. New social structures emerge based on local resources, cooperative survival, and the protection of life-giving water sources. The continent remains dangerous and unpredictable, but life persists, shaped and hardened by 20 years of relentless struggle. As the decades pass, the landscape of America continues to evolve under the shadow of the Great Collapse. The river valleys carved by the catastrophic floods have settled into new, unpredictable courses, and many formerly fertile plains remain permanently waterlogged or covered in sediment and debris. Seasonal flooding is now a constant threat, with small communities having to relocate every few years to higher ground. Former agricultural centers have transformed into marshlands or wastelands, forcing survivors to adapt with localized food production, aquaculture in newly formed wetlands, and carefully rationed foraging. The population remains sparse and highly fragmented. Communities rely on fortified enclaves near remaining freshwater sources or coastal desalination plants, which are carefully defended against raiders. Travel between settlements is perilous. The old interstate system is largely destroyed, with only crude, hand-cleared paths and rivers used as makeshift transport routes. Caravans must navigate through unpredictable terrain, dealing with natural hazards and hostile groups that control critical resources. Economic and social systems are entirely decentralized. Barter has replaced currency, with water, food, and fuel serving as the primary forms of trade. Communities that manage to cultivate medicinal plants, repair old machinery, or harness renewable energy gain significant influence over their neighbors. Knowledge of survival skills, water purification techniques, and environmental stewardship has become the most valuable currency. passed carefully from one generation to the next. The ecological consequences of the collapse remain profound. Forests and wetlands have begun to reclaim abandoned farmland and urban areas, but toxic sediment from destroyed dams continues to pollute soil and water. Many species of fish and wildlife have adapted to the new conditions, while others have vanished entirely. The environmental balance is fragile, and small mistakes such as overfishing or mismanaged irrigation can have catastrophic ripple effects across local ecosystems. Technology has been adapted for a low-resource world. Steam engines, wind turbines, and small-scale solar setups power critical infrastructure, while old knowledge from engineering, medicine, and agriculture guides reconstruction efforts. Communities are inventive, using salvaged materials to build water storage systems, irrigation channels, and protective barriers against seasonal floods. Cultural memory is both a guide and a warning. Stories of the lost cities, the power of the dams, and the floods themselves are told as cautionary tales. Rituals and festivals often center on water, celebrating survival and commemorating the ancestors who endured the initial collapse. Education focuses on practical survival, resource management, and preserving knowledge of the old world, ensuring that each new generation can navigate a continent forever changed by the simultaneous failure of nearly 92,000 dams. Centuries after the simultaneous collapse of every dam in America, the continent has been reshaped almost beyond recognition. The old nation exists now only in memory, recorded in tattered books and the oral histories of scattered communities. Former coastlines have been redrawn by silt and sediment, river courses permanently altered by the violent surges of water, and vast inland seas have replaced fertile valleys. Many regions once dense with human settlement are now forests, marshes, or barren plains, where wildlife has either adapted or vanished entirely. The remnants of humanity live in isolated, self-sufficient communities. Knowledge of agriculture, water management, and basic engineering is the lifeblood of society. Wells, cisterns, and carefully maintained springs are fiercely protected, and water scarcity dictates almost every aspect of life. Children grow up learning to read weather patterns, predict floods, and purify water, ensuring the survival of each enclave. Civilization has reverted to a decentralized agrarian state, yet it is a world rich with ingenuity and resilience. Despite the hardship, ecosystems are recovering in unexpected ways. Wetlands formed by breached dams have become havens for birds and fish, while forests reclaim abandoned towns. Predatory and herbivorous species flourish in the absence of human encroachment. Some areas, however, remain permanently uninhabitable due to lingering toxic sediments and the aftermath of nuclear and industrial disasters triggered in the collapse. Humans must navigate around these dead zones using knowledge of the terrain and resource distribution to survive. Trade and communication are slow but crucial. Caravans transport food, water, and tools between communities, and alliances are formed based on mutual survival rather than political borders. Festivals and storytelling keep cultural identity alive, commemorating the time before the dams and teaching lessons about the fragility of human control over nature. Water is no longer taken for granted. It is revered, rationed, and embedded into every aspect of society. The collapse serves as a permanent reminder of humanity's dependence on infrastructure. Once symbols of engineering prowess, the dams are now ghostly relics, their ruins monuments to both ingenuity and hubris. The simultaneous failure of nearly 92,000 dams did not just destroy cities and kill millions, it rewrote the rules of life on the continent. Humanity survived, but the Earth they inherited is a planet governed by water itself. In the end, the story of America's dams is both a warning and a testament. It shows how civilization can be built and lost in the blink of an eye, and how survival depends on adaptability, knowledge, and respect for the forces of nature. Though the continent is unrecognizable, life persists in the quiet forests along the reclaimed rivers, and within the fortified enclaves, humans continue to endure. A resilient species forever shaped by the great water that once defined and then destroyed their world. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known widely as GERD, is not just a piece of infrastructure. It is a symbol of Ethiopia's ambitions. Rising from the Benishangul-Gumuz region near the Blue Nile, the project has been described as the crown jewel of the country's development. Construction began in the year 2011, and, after more than a decade of work, Ethiopia officially inaugurated the dam in September of 2025. It stands nearly 170 meters tall and stretches close to 2 kilometers across, making it the largest hydroelectric power plant on the African continent. What makes the GERD unique is not only its size, but how it was funded. Unlike many large infrastructure projects that rely on international loans, the Renaissance Dam was largely financed through contributions from Ethiopian citizens, bonds, and state revenues. This gave it the weight of a national project, seen as a matter of sovereignty and pride. For Ethiopia, the dam is meant to double the nation's electricity production, supply power to millions who have lived without reliable energy, and even allow exports of electricity to neighboring countries. Behind its concrete walls lies a vast reservoir with a capacity of about 74 billion cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, it is a man-made lake large enough to cover an area bigger than the entire city of London. For Ethiopia, that reservoir represents stored energy, economic opportunity, and a chance to lift millions out of poverty. But downstream in Sudan and Egypt, the same body of water is viewed with deep unease. The Nile is more than just a river to those countries, it is their lifeline. Egypt, home to over 100 million people, depends on the Nile for more than 90% of its fresh water. Sudan relies on it for agriculture and survival as well. To both nations, the GERD carries the possibility of altering the flow of this ancient river. And while diplomatic disputes over water rights and old colonial-era treaties have dominated headlines, an even darker possibility lurks behind it all. If the dam were ever to fail, whether through accident, natural disaster, or even sabotage, the consequences would unfold on a scale almost too vast to imagine. This is the hidden danger of the Renaissance Dam, a project built as a promise of progress, but shadowed by the risk of catastrophe. And in the scenario we are exploring, that shadow becomes reality. It begins without warning. In this hypothetical scenario, the towering wall of the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam suddenly gives way. Concrete fractures, water roars, and 74 billion cubic meters of stored Nile water surge forward with unstoppable force. Within seconds, what had been a calm reservoir transforms into a tidal wave of destruction. The energy released is equal to several nuclear bombs, but instead of fire and smoke, it is water and chaos. The first to feel the impact would be the communities closest to the dam site. Entire villages along the Blue Nile would be swept away before a single warning could be sounded. Roads, bridges, and farmland would vanish beneath walls of water, moving faster than a person could run. The shockwave would obliterate power lines and communication systems, leaving survivors cut off in the dark. As the flood races downstream, Sudan becomes the next victim. Towns and cities built along the Nile would be overwhelmed within hours. The capital, Khartoum, sitting at the confluence of the Blue and White Nile, would face one of the worst urban floods in modern history. Buildings would collapse, infrastructure would fail, and millions would be forced to flee with nowhere to go. Beyond Sudan, the wave of destruction would continue its march northward toward Egypt. The Nile, usually steady and life-giving, would turn into a raging torrent. Fields that once grew wheat and vegetables would be drowned, villages buried in mud, and ancient sites along the river damaged beyond repair. Even the massive Aswan High Dam could be placed under strain, tested as never before. In only a matter of hours, the entire course of the Nile, from Ethiopia to Egypt, would be transformed. What had once been the foundation of civilizations for thousands of years would become a corridor of devastation, and yet this would only be the beginning. The breach itself is just the spark. What follows are the long-term consequences that no nation could fully prepare for. In this hypothetical disaster, the true devastation is measured not just in collapsed bridges and flooded farmland, but in the lives upended. Millions of people across Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt depend directly on the Nile for water, food, and survival. When the dam breaks, their homes, villages, and entire communities would be swept away in hours. Families would be scattered, with countless forced to flee toward higher ground carrying only what they could grab in moments of chaos. Sudan would likely face the greatest immediate displacement. Cities like Khartoum and Omdurman could see hundreds of thousands of residents stranded, with roads cut off and supply chains severed. Hospitals would be overwhelmed within days, not only by injuries from the flood, but by outbreaks of waterborne disease spreading through polluted floodwaters. Drinking water supplies would collapse, forcing survivors to rely on unsafe sources that increase the risk of cholera and other deadly illnesses. In Egypt, the crisis would play out differently, but with no less urgency. The Nile supports nearly the entire population of the country, and sudden disruption to its flow would cripple water distribution networks. Crops vital for daily food supplies would be destroyed, leaving millions at risk of hunger. Refugee flows from Sudan would surge northward, creating political and humanitarian strain on a nation already managing high population density. Beyond the immediate region, the human cost would spill across borders. International aid organizations would struggle to deliver assistance as destroyed infrastructure blocks entry into the hardest hit zones. Camps would form rapidly, but overcrowding and lack of sanitation would add to the suffering. The sheer scale of the crisis would push global relief systems to their limits. This wave of human suffering highlights the reality that a dam break is never only about physical destruction. It is about destabilizing entire societies, leaving millions without security, shelter, or hope. And as the survivors fight for survival in the aftermath, the political and economic consequences of this catastrophe would soon come into focus. As the floodwaters recede, the hypothetical disaster would shift from an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe to an intense political crisis. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have long-standing fragile agreements over Nile water usage, and the dam's failure would instantly shatter decades of negotiation. Ethiopia would face international scrutiny and anger for what is perceived as negligence, even if the breach was caused by natural factors beyond human control. Regional stability would be at risk, with neighbors demanding accountability and reparations for the unprecedented loss of life and property. Sudan, reeling from the destruction of the Gezira Plain and the collapse of downstream dams, would confront political turmoil. The government would struggle to maintain control as millions of displaced citizens compete for dwindling resources. Local authorities in Khartoum and other major cities would face immense pressure to provide shelter, food, and security, all while attempting to prevent civil unrest. Egypt's reliance on the Nile for over 90% of its freshwater would place the country in an extremely vulnerable position. The emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam, intended to prevent its own collapse, would lead to widespread flooding along the Nile Valley. Agricultural regions, some of the most fertile in the world, would be devastated, triggering food shortages and threatening the livelihoods of millions of farmers. Diplomatic relations with Ethiopia would reach a breaking point, as the Egyptian government demands international intervention and compensation. International organizations would be drawn into the crisis. The United Nations, the African Union, and humanitarian agencies would scramble to coordinate relief, mediate disputes, and deliver aid across borders. The global community would be forced to confront the cascading effects of infrastructure failure on diplomacy, regional security, and economic stability. Ultimately, the political fallout of a Gorges breach would rival the physical devastation. Governments would be under immense pressure from both domestic populations and international observers. The failure of a single engineering project could redefine the balance of power in Northeast Africa, leaving nations politically fractured while the human toll continues to mount. Within days, the waters from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, joined by the collapsed Rosaires and Sennar dams in Sudan, would surge northward along the Nile toward Egypt. The Aswan High Dam, Egypt's last major line of defense, would face unprecedented pressure. Although it is a colossal structure, it was never designed to withstand a sudden, massive pulse of water originating from hundreds of kilometers upstream. Emergency releases from its spillways would be necessary to prevent structural failure, but these measures would only shift the disaster downstream. Cities along the Nile, including Luxor, Aswan, and Kena, would experience severe flooding. Streets, homes, and farmlands could be submerged under several meters of water, displacing millions of residents. Agricultural infrastructure that sustains much of Egypt's food supply would be destroyed or rendered unusable. The inundation of croplands would also lead to soil degradation and the loss of planting cycles, causing long-term food insecurity. The humanitarian impact would be catastrophic. Millions would require immediate evacuation, shelter, and medical attention, with the spread of waterborne diseases such as cholera becoming a severe threat. Access to clean drinking water and sanitation would collapse in affected areas, compounding the public health crisis. Meanwhile, transportation networks along the Nile would be rendered impassable, slowing relief efforts and preventing efficient distribution of aid. Economically, Egypt would face crippling losses. The flooding would destroy homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure, potentially setting back development by decades. Insurance systems and government emergency funds would be overwhelmed, while the international community would be called upon for both financial and logistical support. The cascading disaster would also have geopolitical consequences, Tensions between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia would escalate as each nation seeks to protect its population while assigning blame for the devastation. International mediation would be essential, yet complex, as the scale of destruction makes cooperative solutions increasingly difficult. By the end of the first week, the initial floodwaters would have reshaped the Nile Valley in both Sudan and Egypt. Entire communities would be displaced, fertile lands submerged, and the very fabric of regional stability shaken. The GERD, intended as a symbol of progress, would instead stand as a monument to the immense risks inherent in massive infrastructure projects. In the months following the dam collapse, the scale of destruction across Northeast Africa becomes painfully clear. In Sudan, the devastation of the Gezira plain has destroyed nearly 40% of the nation's agricultural land, leaving millions at risk of famine. Displaced populations crowd into makeshift camps along higher ground, struggling with limited food, shelter, and sanitation. Outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread rapidly, overwhelming the already strained healthcare system. Egypt faces long-term consequences as well. Emergency releases from the Aswan High Dam would have caused severe soil erosion and degradation of farmland along the Nile, diminishing crop yields for multiple growing seasons. Cities like Luxor and Aswan would face months of cleanup and reconstruction, with damaged infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and ports limiting economic recovery. The disruption to irrigation networks would further exacerbate the agricultural crisis, leaving millions dependent on food aid. Environmental damage is profound. Fish populations and river ecosystems are decimated, and sediment displacement alters the natural course of the Nile. Wetlands and riparian zones along the river suffer catastrophic habitat loss, affecting countless species. In some areas, chemical pollutants and debris left behind by the floods contaminate soil and water for years, threatening both human and ecological health. Politically, the disaster reshapes regional relationships. Ethiopia's reputation suffers as the GERD, once a symbol of national pride, becomes a source of international conflict. Sudan and Egypt demand accountability, and diplomatic tensions intensify. Efforts to rebuild trust and negotiate water sharing agreements are slow and fraught with mistrust. The economic cost is staggering. Billions of dollars are lost in infrastructure, agriculture, and property, and the region's development is set back decades. International aid is essential, but logistical challenges and political disputes slow the delivery of relief. Communities must rely heavily on local resources and ingenuity to survive. For the people who survive, life is transformed. Urban centers along the Nile are partially abandoned, while rural areas struggle to recover. Basic services like electricity, healthcare, and clean water are limited or absent. Social structures are tested, and new systems of local governance and community cooperation emerge out of necessity. The dam's failure leaves a permanent scar on Northeast Africa. The Blue Nile's course, local topography, and regional ecosystems are forever changed. What was intended as a symbol of progress and prosperity becomes a stark lesson in the risks of massive infrastructure projects. Ultimately, the collapse of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam serves as a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's forces. It shows how one catastrophic failure can ripple across borders, devastate populations, and alter the course of history. In the wake of the disaster, the region is forced to confront the limits of control, resilience, and cooperation.